Hello and welcome to my tutorial on Introduction to Subdivision Modeling, or in this case, inorganic modeling, where we'd be modeling mostly metal objects, plastic objects, anything that isn't alive. Because if you look at anything you have or own that's organic, inorganic, say your keyboard, mine happens to be made of aluminum and rubber and all sorts of other crap. My monitors, go look at a car. You're not going to ever find a truly hard edge where there is absolutely no roundness to it. You may find something close, for example, a knife. That's a little bit different, but even then, there's high poly modeling or subdivision modeling involved with that in other parts of it. So what we're going to do today is we're going to cover the basics of understanding how it works, and it will definitely give you a great introduction and foundation to start making your own high poly models. So here I have for you today, and I will explain in a few minutes after we make our own, is 3 models. One is not subdivided, one is set up to be subdivided, and one is also set up to be subdivided. But as you can see, these are different. These edges are much closer together. These are much farther apart. And you will see why in a few seconds. So what we're going to do is we are going to render out a frame. And at the moment, everything is nice and flat, doesn't look natural in any way whatsoever. And we're going to change that. So we're going to apply a Turbo Smooth modifier to this. And we're going to press F4 to turn off edge faces. And you can see now it's much better. It reflects the light, and it looks more like a piece of metal. We go to this one, we're going to add a Turbo Smooth modifier, up the iterations to 3, and render that out. As you can see, they now look a lot more natural, and well, they reflect light on the edges like any piece of metal would. So now you're wondering, probably, why does it do that? Why did you get the results? Well, for example, these edges are much closer together, so they are much tighter, and this edge and that edge and each edge placement tells the smoothing where to stop. And that's really the basic of it, the most basic way to describe it. There's multiple ways of smoothing, as I described in my last tutorial. You can use NURBS, which is better in my opinion, if you want to just quickly toggle it and be able to have a much less cluttered mess without using modifiers. You can turbo smooth it, which really makes it pretty much unusable, and you can't, if you keep that modifier on there, it's a much more difficult way to model. So we'll get into that a different day. Right now, I would like to delete these boxes and get you started on your own. So drag a box here, and here. Whoops. I'm going to delete this first box, it sucks. And then move these over here. If you're not following along perfectly fine, that's totally understandable. As long as you get the concepts, that's really all that matters. So this is less of a do-it-yourself tutorial and more understand the concepts that I'm trying to teach you. So what we're going to do is right-click, convert to editable poly, or right-click up here in the modifier panel, convert to editable poly. I prefer up here. It just seems faster in my opinion than right-clicking and going through a menu which you may or may not hit. So what we're going to do is use the Swift Loop tool, which creates what are called edge loops, which basically, as you can see, those are all edges that I'd be creating. And it places them in a loop around your object or anything that has quads, which we'll also get into. So I'd like you to place them exactly as I am doing, and make sure you don't forget any, because let's say we have it like this, and we are missing a loop back here. Turbo smooth it. It does not work very well. You can see that it's sloped down here, but it keeps the shape up here, and that's because we don't have that supporting loop up here to tell it to keep that shape. So now we place it here, smooth it out, it looks much better. You can't miss a loop unless it's intentional, because it'll just look stupid. Then for this next one, I'd like you to convert that to an editable poly as well. and add some really tight swift loop or edge loops like we did in my example. And then use NURBS or Turbo Smooth, whatever your preference. Up the iterations to 3 to get a nice hard edge. This cage, when you have edged faces selected, will be a way for you to manipulate the object, which is something we don't really need to get into now. But I prefer to turn it off when I have, for example, this selected, because it clutters up my model. So pressing 2, I go to edged mode, and then pressing F4 on the keyboard, I turn off all edges. But I mean, most of these things, I'm assuming you did my bottle tutorial. If you haven't done that, I would suggest doing that now, because I teach you a lot of the keyboard shortcuts you need to be able to do all of these things naturally. Pressing F4, I go to my next one. I'm going to right-click this one, convert to editable poly, and with this one, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to make a more complex shape, just slightly. So press 4 on your keyboard and click on the top polygon and press delete. And we're going to press 3 and select border mode, which is all these polygons are now not connected to a second polygon. So we can enter border mode and shift and drag this up by clicking on the Z-axis. And then we're now going to press R and click in the middle and scale that evenly. As you can see, it doesn't distort because we clicked in the middle. But if we were to click here or here, it doesn't work right. We need it right in the middle. And then we are going to go over here to our modifier panel with the border selected and click cap. And as you can see, we now capped off that shape. Well, let's talk a little bit about what quads are. I mean, it's pretty obvious, a quadrilateral. There's 4 sides. It's a quad. That's pretty much the basis of high poly modeling, is to make sure you maintain quads generally. It's good for having good topology, which is something else that I'll try to touch on this lesson. But you want to just use defining edges. I mean, again, it isn't important if you follow everything I'm doing. Just trying to understand the concepts is all that matters at this point. So now if we were to press F4 and turn on NURBS, we would get that nice edge that we want. It's not perfect, but you get the concept. Oftentimes, when you are placing edge loops, you'll have to use the cut tool to manually get it how you want it to, because edge loops don't always follow the line that you want. For example, you can see up here, the edges are much harder than they are down here. And that was just because I automatically placed the edge loops. It can cause a lot of issues to just go around randomly placing edge loops, but for learning's sake, it's not a bad place to start. Another thing I'd like to talk about is when you are doing high poly modeling, what I'm going to continue on about with the quads is that maintaining all quads is very good for topology. It allows there to be less deformations in your shapes. For example, I'm going to bring up something I'm working on at the moment. It's this rifle right here. It's got a long ways to go, but it's not too bad. But I didn't really have the greatest topology, but you can see that almost everything here is divided into a quad, and that I have all of these edges, even though they aren't that great, and they need to be cleaned up, and they will. Modeling can definitely be a very messy process, and sometimes it doesn't matter, sometimes it does, and you'll kind of learn that along the way. This model has a lot of issues at the moment because I kind of screwed it up, but you can see I've got my edges that define the shape, and if I select them, you can see how they run the length of the object and define the edges. This red right here. And I turn back on my smoothing. You can see those nice edges and how they look a lot more natural and more mechanical. Another thing I'd like to talk about that has to do with high poly modeling is oftentimes, let's say you see a model like this. Well, you can actually see that this isn't I didn't model these little things individually into here. It's inefficient, it's a waste of time. You can do it, and there's some situations that it's worth doing, but let's say you're making a game asset, and we'll get into this later, it's not efficient. And just to kind of give you an understanding of the tools that you use when you're high poly modeling, these are called floaters. Now, they're called that because they don't actually touch the geometry. So if we were to look down this side right here, you see they just float. They never ever really interfere with it. But when you turn this off, they look like they do. And when you're baking what's called a normal map, which hopefully you understand at this point, even if it's not in any of my tutorials, it's pretty basic thing to understand if you like games or you play games or you've ever modded. When you bake the normal map, these will be added as details in the low poly model, which is another thing we'll get into another day. But just know that if you are making things for games or plan to, almost none of these objects are worth making touch your model. It's just inefficient. You know, things like this, you can just move them around, see what you like, see what looks good. So that's basically, you know, what I want to talk about as far as floaters. I got floaters covered, edges. Now, if you want to get into topology a little bit, which is what I was actually originally doing before I got distracted because I'm very ADD, let's create a box. Just a nice simple box. You don't have to do this, but I want to explain this a little bit better. Let's chain for this vertex right here, and we make a triangle. Well, naturally, you know, as you've seen from all of these models, I can just click or have my cursor over this, and it'll make an edge loop around this model. Well, this time it doesn't work that way because we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sided shapes, and actually this is counted as an edge, so it's a 6-sided shape. If you want to have an edge loop go all the way around an object, you need to either have it be all quads, or you're going to have to do it on your own and define that shape. And it can just make modeling and life in general a lot more difficult. So again, here you can see I tried to get my quads back. I move this up a little bit. Move this up. And move this up. And it just takes a lot longer, and it's a very inefficient way to model. Sometimes you will have to do it, and not all the time do triangles make things awful, but it's generally a rule when you're modeling to try and avoid as many triangles as possible, as well as n-gons, but sometimes you can get away with it. So if we smooth it, I mean, obviously it looks awful, but because of this edge, it maintained its shape to some degree. But it makes it so you can't have a good edge flow, and it can just make things more inefficient and waste a lot more time in the end. So keeping your quads is important. It's kind of hard to give an example just using standard primitives, but let's say, well, let me give you a really quick and unexplained version of how I'd model something. Let's say on here, how I'd model a basic shape like this. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I generally don't start out with a primitive. I actually like to model with splines, which is a totally different thing, and I'll get into that a whole nother day. But I would go along making something like this. And normally I'd take a lot more time on this, straighten it out, make it look really good, make sure the edges are nice and good looking. But I start out with something like this, get my shape down, and to give you a realistic reason to split things into quads is this. I move this up, it's in the same 2D plane. So if I go into my top view, turn it to shaded so there's no shadows, it makes it easier shape to read. I would take the cut tool, press 1 to see my vertices, and we can make this into a quad. So this is now a quad. This is not. So let's say we want to do a swift loop and we wanted to define this edge. Well, that's not going to happen because my line now stops there. Sure, I could go draw it out, whatever, or I give you an alternative solution. Split the rest into quads. And now we have 4 quads. And our line will go all the way down. And then we just have to simply control click these 2 vertices, move them up, and now we have a much more consistent edge flow. And then let's say I wanted to actually take this and make this into something worth looking at. I would most likely press P on my keyboard, rotate this, and press A on my keyboard to turn on angle snaps, which allow you to snap by 5 degrees. And it allows you to have a perfect 90-degree angle. Raise this up. And then I would press 3 on my keyboard, shift click out, and then now we actually have a shape. I would generally apply a symmetry modifier, collapse that, and now I have my basic shape with its line. And then we can just continue adding edge loops, or you could do it manually. It really depends on what the shape is, but if, let's say, it's just a simple shape like this, and as you can see here, well, I'm not going to do that for now. I'll show you that in a second. Even if you don't understand what I'm talking about in a second, that's fine. We've got our shape, and then we were to smooth this. You can see how these are nice hard edges, right? Well, we smooth it, now it smooths them out because we're missing essential edge loops. And we can add those by we can have either a tight one, or we can have a nice loose sloped one. We smooth that up the iterations, and you can see how smooth this one is and how harsh and tight that one is. And then over here we didn't even do anything, so we could do like a mix, or sometimes, you know what, just don't even have one. If you want to just half define the shape, you can do that as well. So it'll define the shape a little bit better, but not totally finish it. It really depends on what the situation is, what you're trying to make, what you need. But yeah, so that's pretty much the most basic way you can make a shape that's really effective. I think my next tutorial will probably be high poly spline modeling, or making shapes with splines. Personally, I prefer it as a workflow. It's just much more efficient in my opinion, and I always find I can be more creative that way and make much more complex objects. But it really depends person to person, for example, and what you're making. I mean, for this barrel right here, I started out with a cylinder. Or with this, I don't even remember what this started out as. Cylinder, sphere that was cut in half. I mean, it's just basically 3ds Max, After Effects, Photoshop, everything is all about understanding these tools and learning how to put them together to create things. I mean, you can understand all the basic functions, all the modifiers, but being creative and learning how to bring them together to make something is really what will define how good you become and allow you to become more creative, because it is a creative process besides the fact that you're making something, and it's a very creative learning path, just modeling and any type of really 3D thing in general. I would like to touch on one more thing. This material I'm using is what I prefer when I'm high poly modeling. As you can see in here, it's very reflective, and it allows me to, for example, there's things called pinching, which is when you have shapes that just don't work very well. I mean, I'm not also going to say I'm a very good modeler. I've only been modeling a short time, but you can see here, I did this really poorly, and I still have to fix it. But, you know, I didn't have a very good, I'm missing a few edge loops here, and it doesn't look good at all. It's actually really terrible, and that's because these edges don't continue, and I actually broke it into an n-gon right there, and it just sucks. I need to fix that. But pinching is something like this. It gets really tight, and then there's this negative edge that goes into this positive edge, or where this goes down farther than it should. There's lots and lots of examples of it, but learning how to deal with that is always something that's really, really important. It can affect a lot of things like your normal mapping bakes, and it just looks crappy in general. You can see some pinching right here. It's important to try to avoid those things. But now let's talk about this material and why it's so useful. So in my material editor, you can drag out a standard material, double click it, 3ds Max 2013, which I highly recommend using as there's a lot of bug fixes that make life easier. It also tells you what one is open in your parameters by having an outline. So go to your diffuse, turn that down, turn the diffuse to a dark gray, turn the specular up to about 70. It doesn't really matter exactly, as long as it's higher than 50 generally works perfect. And then you can see now these basic shapes. If we press M, and let's select a shape, exit that mode, have that shape selected, press M, drag it onto there. Just makes it look a little bit nicer. It's clean to work with and allows you to see your edges very, very well. So you can now look at all the things that we have done in this lesson and render them out. We got ourselves some nice high poly models. Now, of course, these sort of models would never be useful in a game, and that's why you may bake what's called a normal map. I'm going to bring up a really quick example of a normal map, but let's see. Right here. This is a terrible normal map bake I did. I mean, it's awful. It's a mixture of using Endo 2 to make one from a texture and a horrible bake in 3ds Max. But a normal map, basically, as you can see, it's made up of a bunch of different colors, but each of these colors tells the low poly object how the light will affect it, and in essence it tries to emulate the low poly, or it tries to emulate the high poly object on the low poly object. So for example, this would be just a plain cube with no subdivisions, but we'd make it look like the high poly one by baking a normal map. It's something I'll get into later, and to be totally honest, I'm not that great at it. I mean, I've only been doing 3D for about 4 months. So that's actually next on my list to get into. But I hope this was somewhat informative. It was kind of disjointed, and I'll be totally honest, I kind of get distracted while I'm talking. I have very bad ADD, but I think that if you just watched it, it should be pretty helpful for you, even though it's over 20 minutes. But yeah, and if you'd like to figure out how to set up a scene like this, I'd highly recommend checking out my bottle tutorial. It's the only tutorial I have on my page besides this one, or on my YouTube channel, and it'll teach you a lot of this stuff, and it'll get you even into high poly modeling different shaped objects that are not so rectangular. My next tutorial will be spline modeling to make a little bit more complex shape. I'm going to try to go slow, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you will view my next one. Have a good day.